The cafe smelled of fresh roses and warm chocolate, a place where love stories were supposed to begin, not end. Emily sat across from Jake, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if trying to hold onto something slipping away. Laughter and whispered confessions filled the air, but between them, there was only silence. A silence that spoke of unspoken fears, unshed tears, and a looming farewell neither of them wanted to face. Jake, dressed in his usual navy jacket, looked at her like he was memorizing her face. Every freckle, every curve of her smile, as if engraving it into his soul. In 48 hours, he'd be gone, leaving behind the life they had built, the love they had nurtured. Emily forced a smile, trying to make this night feel normal, like any other Valentine's Day they had spent together. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't just another date. This was a countdown to goodbye. What she didn't know was that inside Jake's jacket pocket sat a small velvet box, its weight heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind, but now, sitting in front of her, the words refused to come out. Because proposing before leaving meant asking her to wait, asking her to endure the lonely nights, the uncertainty, the fear of a knock on the door bringing news no one wanted to hear. And he wasn't sure if he had the right to do that to her. Emily met his eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." His heart stilled. Was she about to say goodbye first? He had carried the ring for weeks, but today it felt heavier than ever. Jake's fingers grazed the velvet box hidden deep in his pocket, each touch sending a surge of anxiety through him. The cafe's soft melodies played in the background, but all he could hear was the relentless pounding of his own heart. He had played this moment over in his mind 1,000 times, kneeling down, watching Emily's eyes light up, hearing her say yes. But now, sitting across from her, the fear was suffocating. What if she wasn't ready? What if leaving for his deployment shattered the very thing he was trying to hold on to? His mouth opened, ready to spill the words he'd rehearsed, but before he could say anything, Emily leaned closer. Her breath was warm against his ear, but the words that followed sent an icy chill down his spine. "Jake, I need to tell you something." Everything inside him froze. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the cafe's noise like a blade. Jake's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing through every terrible possibility. Was she going to end things? Leave him before he even had the chance to propose? His chest tightened as he held his breath, waiting for the words that could change everything. But before Emily could speak, the waiter appeared at their table, balancing plates of steaming food. The fragile tension snapped like a thread. Emily forced a polite smile, murmuring a quick thank you, but her eyes never met Jake's again. The air between them felt heavier now, thick with unspoken words. Jake could feel it. Whatever she had to say wasn't small. It was the kind of truth that could break hearts. And suddenly, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. They weren't always this fragile. Jake's mind wandered back to their first Valentine's Day, 2 years ago, sitting on the hood of his old car, sharing a greasy, cheap pizza under a sky full of stars. They laughed until their sides hurt, made promises with no fear of the future, and believed love was enough to conquer anything. Back then, life was simple. There was no talk of deployments, no countdown hanging over their heads. But now, everything felt different. Every glance between them lingered too long. Every word seemed like it could be their last. The carefree laughter had been replaced with heavy silences, and even the simplest touch felt loaded with meaning. Jake swallowed hard, pushing past the knot in his throat. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, hoping to find that spark again, to remind them both of who they were before the shadow of war loomed over them. But Emily hesitated. Her hand pulled back ever so slightly, like she wasn't sure if she could hold on. That tiny hesitation felt like a knife to Jake's heart. It wasn't just distance, it was doubt. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. Sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. They ate in slow, mechanical bites, but neither tasted a thing. The space between them felt like a widening chasm, filled with everything they weren't saying. Jake's heart was a storm. He wanted to grab her hand, look into her eyes, and tell her everything. how much he loved her, how much he needed her to wait for him, how the thought of leaving without her promise felt unbearable. But Emily's eyes were far away, lost in a place Jake couldn't reach. She stared past him, through him, like her mind was already somewhere else, maybe in a future where he wasn't coming back. The clock on the cafe wall ticked mercilessly, each second pulling them closer to goodbye. Every moment they let pass felt like a theft, a memory they'd never reclaim. Jake opened his mouth, finally ready to break the silence, to say the words that had been suffocating him. But before a single sound escaped, Emily pushed back her chair and stood up. "I need some air," she whispered, grabbing her coat. Jake sat frozen, his heart pounding as he watched her weave through the crowded cafe and vanish into the bustling street outside. The world around him continued, couples laughing, forks clinking against plates. But for Jake, everything had come to a standstill. His mind spun in circles. Was this it? Was she walking away for good? The ring in his pocket felt heavier than ever, like it was searing through his jacket, branding him with regret. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He had pictured smiles, maybe even tears of joy, but not this. Not Emily slipping through his fingers like sand. For a moment, he sat there, paralyzed by fear and doubt. But then something inside him snapped. He couldn't let her go, not without a fight. He shot up from his seat, heart racing, and dashed toward the door, pushing past the crowd. He wasn't ready to lose her. Not like this. When he found her, she was crying. Emily stood by the river's edge, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold in the pieces that were falling apart. The cold wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Her shoulders trembled, not just from the chill in the air but from something deeper, something Jake felt in his own chest. He approached slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the rush of the water. She turned to face him, her eyes swollen and red, glistening with tears that cut deeper than any words ever could. For a brief moment, they just stood there, caught between everything they wanted to say and everything they were too afraid to admit. Then, suddenly, the dam broke. "I can't do this, Jake," she blurted out, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. "I can't watch you leave, not knowing if you'll come back." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of his lungs. But he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't done. There was more, and it was going to hurt. "Then come with me," he whispered, his voice raw, almost desperate. Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. "You know I can't, Jake. That's not my life." Those words shattered something inside him. The dream he'd held onto, the future he pictured with her by his side, was slipping away, dissolving into the cold night air. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching everything he loved tumble into the abyss. But just as the weight of her words settled over him, Emily's voice softened, trembling with something deeper. "But there's something else." Jake's heart clenched. He could see it in her eyes. Whatever she was about to say would change everything. He braced himself, unsure if he was ready to hear it. "I'm pregnant." The words hit Jake harder than anything he'd ever faced, louder than the city's chaos around them. For a moment, the world seemed to blur. The distant honking cars, the rushing river, even the cold wind whipping against his face. None of it mattered. His breath caught in his throat. "What?" he whispered, barely able to form the word. Emily nodded, her face streaked with tears. "I found out last week. I didn't know how to tell you, especially with you leaving." Jake felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, like everything he knew had been pulled out from under his feet. His mind raced, trying to process the weight of her words. In an instant, everything had changed. This wasn't just about leaving anymore. It wasn't just about them. It was about something more. Something they hadn't planned, but now couldn't ignore. The ring in his pocket suddenly felt like fate. Jake's fingers wrapped around the small velvet box, his hands trembling as he pulled it from his jacket. The weight of everything, her words, their future, the unknown, pressed down on him. But in that moment, he knew what he had to do. Emily's eyes widened in shock as she saw the box, her breath catching in her throat. "Jake, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaky with disbelief. But Jake didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, the cold ground biting through his jeans, but he didn't care. The words he'd been holding back for so long finally spilled out, raw and unfiltered. "I don't want to leave without knowing you're mine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Emily's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the man she loved into a swirl of fear and hope. She was torn between the terror of what lay ahead and the undeniable love that tethered her to him. She stared at him, the weight of 1,000 emotions crashing down. For a heartbeat, time stood still. The city noise faded, the cold wind disappeared, and all that remained was the fragile space between them. Jake on one knee, holding out not just a ring, but his entire heart. Emily's chest tightened, her mind racing through every memory, every fear, every hope tangled into one overwhelming knot. Then, through a veil of tears, she whispered, "Yes." Jake's heart soared for a brief, fleeting moment, but as he looked into her eyes, he saw it, the fear, the uncertainty that still clung to her like a shadow. This wasn't the joyful, perfect ending he had dreamed of. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. A love tested by distance, by war, by the unknown. A love that could survive, or break under the weight of what was coming. They spent their last night together, tangled in love and fear. In the dim light of her apartment, the world outside ceased to exist. They clung to each other like lifelines, their bodies pressed close, as if sheer proximity could keep the inevitable at bay. Every kiss was a silent plea, every touch a desperate attempt to etch the memory of this night into their souls. Jake's hands moved gently over Emily's skin, his fingers tracing invisible circles on her back, memorizing every curve, every detail, as if it would be the last time. His heart ached with the weight of everything he couldn't say, everything he feared he might never get the chance to. Emily buried her face into his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, trying to anchor herself in the sound. She didn't speak, didn't dare break the fragile silence, but inside, she prayed that this wouldn't be their last night, that somehow, against all odds, he would come back to her. But the night was fleeting, and morning was just a few hours away, carrying with it the goodbye they both dreaded. The airport was colder than they expected. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by the sterile hum of announcements and rolling suitcases, Emily and Jake stood at the departure gate, their world shrinking to the space between their intertwined fingers. Emily's grip was tight, her knuckles white as if letting go would make it all too real. "Come back to me," she whispered, her voice trembling, on the verge of breaking. Her eyes searched his, desperate for a reassurance even he wasn't sure he could give. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight with unshed emotion. "I will. I promise." But in moments like these, promises felt fragile, thin threads trying to hold back a tide of uncertainty. He leaned in, pressing one last kiss to her forehead, trying to pour every unspoken word into that brief touch. Then, with a final, lingering look, he turned and walked toward his gate. Emily stood frozen, her hand falling to her side, empty and cold. As Jake disappeared into the crowd, she felt it, a piece of her heart leaving with him, carried into the unknown. Weeks turned into months, and letters became their lifeline. From dusty outposts and foreign landscapes, Jake wrote to Emily whenever he could, his words soaked with longing and love. Each letter was a thread connecting them across the miles, his handwriting a familiar comfort in a world that felt increasingly distant. Emily kept every single one, tucked away like treasures. On sleepless nights, she'd unfold them, reading his words until she could almost hear his voice whispering in her ear. But as the months dragged on, the letters began to arrive less frequently. Days stretched into weeks without word, and each silent day gnawed at the edges of Emily's heart. She tried to stay strong, clutching the fading ink as if it could keep her hope alive. Then, one day, the letters stopped altogether. No explanation, no warning, just silence. And that silence was louder than anything she'd ever known. She feared the worst when there was a knock at her door. For days, Emily had braced herself for the inevitable. A letter, a call, a uniformed officer at her doorstep. So when the knock finally came, her heart sank, her breath catching in her chest. With trembling hands, she opened the door, ready to face her worst nightmare. But instead there he was. Jake stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and tired, his uniform wrinkled from the journey. But his eyes, those familiar, beautiful eyes, were alive. Emily's heart stopped, her mind struggling to believe what she was seeing. Before she could utter a word, Jake dropped to one knee, pulling out the same velvet box he'd carried with him through war and distance. His voice was rough, but steady. "I made it back, Em. Now let's make forever." Tears streamed down her face as the weight of all the fear, the waiting, the heartbreak melted into overwhelming relief. This wasn't just a return. It was the beginning of their forever. And this time, her answer was stronger than ever. Through tears, Emily whispered, "I was always yours, Jake. But now you're ours." She gently guided his trembling hand to her growing belly, the warmth of new life pulsing beneath his fingertips. Jake's breath hitched, his heart swelling with a feeling he'd never known. A mix of overwhelming love, relief, and something deeper, something eternal. For the first time in months, he felt whole again. The fear, the distance, the silence, they had all been part of the journey that brought them here, to this perfect, fragile moment. Their love had survived the impossible, and now, forever truly began.